Mimecast has released its State of Ransomware Readiness Report for 2022, finding that most cybersecurity leaders experienced the same or increasing numbers of ransomware attacks over last year. Together with Mimecast, organizations can stand strong in the face of cyber attacks, human error, technical failure, and work protected. Mimecast, work protected. Visit securityweekly.com/Mimecast to learn more.
How do you win the race against risk and safely lock down your cloud data without hiring an army of administrators? Introducing Least Privilege Automation, only from Varonis. Varonis eliminates data exposures while your employees work and while they sleep, making intelligent decisions about who needs access to data and who doesn't. Our cloud-native solution analyzes permissions and sharing links, monitors access activity, and classifies sensitive data. Because Varonis knows who can and who does access critical data, our automation safely remediates risky links and permissions. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Varonis.
Hi, folks. I'm Adrian Sanabria, the host of Enterprise Security Weekly. Every week, we interview the most interesting folks we can find, talking about the most pressing cybersecurity issues and challenges facing the enterprise today. Myself and my co-hosts have each been in the industry for decades, long enough to see the patterns in the industry and explore where trends are going. In addition to enterprise challenges, we also follow the vendor space, the most interesting security startups emerging, technology and product trends, all the most interesting funding and acquisition announcements. Finally, we love to discuss the latest trends in tech and how they'll impact cybersecurity. If you're wondering how the latest in AI, quantum computing, cloud, and DevOps is going to impact security a few years down the road, you should follow the Enterprise Security Weekly podcast.
Welcome to RSA 2023. It is day 3. Some of us are running on fumes. Some of us haven't quite gotten our stamina back, having taken a few years off, but we are live at Broadcast Alley, and I'd like to introduce Mayeuresh Ektare. He is Senior Vice, did I do all right on that?
Perfect.
He is Senior Vice President of Product Management for a company called Brinqa. Mayeuresh, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me this morning.
Tell us a little bit about Brinqa.
Certainly, Brinqa centralizes findings and vulnerabilities from various security tools in our organization to really provide a centralized, unified view into the cybersecurity risk. We essentially help the cybersecurity teams to understand, contextualize, and prioritize cyber risk so that they can effectively communicate inside the organization and also remediate with precision.
Okay.
That's what Brinqa really does.
So I wanted to talk a little bit today about sort of the challenge that security teams face in organizations and smaller organizations where the team is just one person. I've been consulting for almost 30 years in the private sector, and I can remember 30 years ago trying to convince companies in the private sector that they need to have a strategic approach to how to do security, how to make the organization secure. And of course, 30 years ago, the big argument was you really need to have a firewall if you're going to plug into this backbone called the internet.
Right.
But there's been a challenge, I think, since day one in trying to get organizations to approach things strategically. They tended to look towards the tools and find all the tools and the solutions.
Right.
And now what do they have today, Mayeuresh?
Exactly. They have more tools, right?
More tools.
More tools. In larger organizations, we often deal with customers who have deployed north of sometimes 50 different security solutions. It isn't unheard of, having tooling at that scale.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge really is, if you take some analogies, right, and apply to some other functions inside an organization, think CRM. No one in their mindset would actually build out a process in an organization without first deploying a CRM. So they're really thinking of what the eventual process in my organization is going to be like, and then you build out your tooling for that process. Instead, in cybersecurity, what happens is, you first start thinking immediately about, do I have an endpoint security solution? Do I have a firewall? Do I have a cloud security solution? And there's just an explosion of tooling.
Mm-hmm.
It's when things become really unmanageable, that's when CISOs and CIOs start really thinking about how do I put this plan together, right?
Right.
Instead, if you start off with a strategic approach, really thinking about, this is how I'm going to orchestrate the entire cybersecurity platform, you will pretty much be in a much better position than individual tools that are, stitched together not in a very right way.
Right. Well, and unfortunately, most companies have been around for a while, and the idea of starting with strategy is, that ship's kind of sailed.
That's true.
The trick is, and I do consulting, I'm advising, I'm not in there trying to push any particular solution, but I've been to so many companies over the years that, I've been to things like RSA, walked the floor, and got all these solutions because how can I live without them? The person said, I must have this. And the trade rags and the social media platforms all say I've got to do this. It's the next big thing. Yep. And so that that shiny object times 100 it sometimes is there. And it's interesting that you're using analogies of other parts of the business. How many things in life or in business do you start with dropping a product in, dropping a solution in before you figure out what you want to do with it? But that's time and time again been the reality in this industry.
Very true, very true. But then there is also, few additional things in cybersecurity, certain parts of cybersecurity that we can actually, take advantage of. Think of the SOC, the modern SOC today. The SOC was sort of evolved when customers were not able to really make sense of, hundreds and thousands of events that were generated by these tools. Right. So there had to be a place where you centralize, aggregate, correlate for threat detection and response. Right. SOC was born. Now, SOC is more on threat detection and remediation, right? Post-attack. Someone's trying to attack, here are the events, let's correlate and figure out what the root cause was. Now, what can the organizations do to reduce their exposure so that they don't get attacked in the first place, right? Is there a place for us to aggregate the exposure and the findings data early on in a centralized repository so that these findings can be prioritized in a more effective way, which are more contextualized for the business to reduce the exposure, right? So that's the viewpoint that we personally take, that there isn't a framework or an orchestration play to really understand the entire attack surface and reduce the exposure. You have to close the attack surface today and fix the exposure if you want to prevent the attacks of tomorrow.
Right. Which ironically is an application of principles of security and protection that date back 30, 40, 50 years. I mean, the whole original idea of internet security was based on a principle of perimeter protection. Right. Put the wall around the castle and pull everybody in and protect your most precious assets are in the innermost bowels of the castle, and figure out how many doors and windows are into the castle and close them. And there's, as I said, I'm a consultant. I've been using the analogies for years and years and years, but and it's funny to me that we got all these sensors, we got all these data points, and now we have to figure out what to do with it. We got what we asked for. Right. Talk to me a little bit about how you, or how Brinqa allows your clients to begin to kind of sort it out. Because again, from a strategic perspective, what are some tips or ideas of how to start to prioritize all that data?
The challenge really comes about when you've got really varying asset types and asset classes. In an organization, the IT infrastructure is oftentimes owned by the CIO or the IT teams, right? Then there is the cloud infrastructure. You've got your containers, you've got your applications, you've got your IoT devices, operating, the operational technology, what have you. Each one of these specialized asset class has a specialized scanning tool dedicated for them, right? The reason that even happens is, first of all, the technologies are different, but the secondly, most important thing is the ownership structure of these assets, right? There isn't a single owner who has the responsibility across all these asset types. Right. So the way we imagine customers really using a solution is to aggregate the risks that they see across all the attack surface. Regardless of what asset type you're looking at, from a business perspective, you really need to understand what your attack surface is across my asset types. And can I really understand what is important for my business today and prioritize those risks to close them. That's the holy grail of really understanding what is important for your business. There are a few things that come about here in this approach. You are looking cybersecurity tools that are scanning these devices, or understanding the vulnerabilities and findings. They're providing raw security data.
Right.
That raw security data really needs to be enhanced for business context. Unless you enrich that data and overlay the business context on it, you're never going to be able to identify what's important for me. A vulnerability that is CVSS 5 or 6 may be really critical for me or my organization. If that happens to be on an asset that is internet facing, it has to be compliant. So the business considerations are often missing in the raw security data.
Right.
And what Brinqa really allows our customers to do is understand the attack surface by having a comprehensive view of their assets, understand the findings or the vulnerabilities, risks associated with each of those assets, and then allow customers to overlay that business context on top so that they can prioritize and communicate the risk at the very precise level.
Now, in my experience as a consultant, many of my clients, I'm an assessor, I do PCI, so I have to go in and make a determination of how well they're meeting a whole myriad of security controls and requirements, and a lot of it has to do with monitoring and detection. There's vulnerability scanning, there's vulnerability management, and so on and so forth. I've seen many companies over the years sort of, because they don't understand what all this data is, specifically vulnerability discovery tools, vulnerability scan engines, they tend to respond to and do exactly what the tools tell them. But as you said, I mean, the context isn't always there, but there is a CVSS score, CVE score, and within PCI says highs and criticals, do something with them. What most people don't realize is that PCI says, oh, by the way, you can define what high critical means.
Right.
And I stopped by your booth the other day, and I got to see a little bit of your tool. Talk to me a little bit about how Brinqa helps you determine what the risk level should be before you determine that this asset needs to be assigned with this level of risk, which is the prioritization, and then you do something about it.
Certainly. So security tools, the scan engines, whether those are vulnerability scanners or others, they do provide raw security data. So they do provide the base risk score that they identify for that particular asset.
Right.
Now, what Brinqa does is we take that into consideration, but we have something called risk factors that are defined by the user, by the customer in their own environment. So they can identify, here are the asset, groups of asset that are supposed to be PCI compliant. So anytime you see a CVSS score 5 or anything, you just offset it by 2 points.
Right.
So we are able to, in an automated way, elevate the security risk scores for certain assets or decrease them based on your context, right? So our strategy is really about taking the input from different tools, but then allow the customers to really fine-tune that score for their organization.
How much do you do in terms of, I'm sure like most tools, you have like an out-of-the-box default, I don't know what you call your setups, but
Right.
Your policies or whatever. How much do you sort of help or coach your clients to, here's an opportunity to make a decision. You don't necessarily have to take the default setting. What do you do to help clients in that manner?
We have out-of-the-box built-in defaults for every single process the customer has to, orchestrate. What our solution really, excels at is really allowing the customers this flexibility in their tooling to allow them to customize it per their needs. I'll give you another example. Vulnerabilities scanning on traditional IT infrastructure. The IT team actually owns patching those assets.
Right.
When it comes to cloud or application security, it's the engineering team. Their processes are a lot different than the IT teams, right? So when you are really looking at Brinqa as a platform, Customers are looking at it as a tool-agnostic approach for defining their cybersecurity policy. This allows larger organizations that have sometimes grown through mergers and acquisition to have any sort of tooling in their environments across their business units, but then have this centralized policy framework that really allows them to operationalize a unified model across the entire organization.
Right. Can you give me some examples of some testimonials? What are your clients saying about, once they've sort of embraced the concept and started using the tool, what kind of things are you hearing from your clients?
What our customers really like about Brinqa is the ability to create a unified cyber risk graph across the organization. It sort of simply becomes like a living, breathing, I would say, analogous to a CMDB that gives you a live snapshot of your organization along with its risk levels across the asset types. Now you have this humongous data set that you can ask any question of, whether you want to identify your security control gaps, whether you want to identify your compliance gaps, or you simply want to identify, I've got these 50 million findings and vulnerabilities. How do I prioritize so that my team has the 100 that they need to work on right now, today, right? That's what our customers really like about the data that we aggregate. Security is no longer a scanning problem. Every tool you've seen across RSA here, stronger together is the message, for 23, RSA 23, and we really believe in that. It's really about how do we make our customers stronger in their cybersecurity posture by bringing in the wide variety of data that these tools provide, but then let them orchestrate their security programs in a unified way.
Great. Well, I want to thank you for your time today. If you want to find out more information at Brinqa, go to securityweekly.com/Brinqa, RSAC. That's BRINQA, and we're out.
Welcome to RSA Conference 2023. We're here recording live from Broadcast Alley in Moscone West. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me for this interview is Lenny Zeltser, CISO of Exonius. How are you, Lenny?
I'm good.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is, I think this is a great topic, and, I think both our companies can actually help with this problem. So today we're talking about how security leaders can demonstrate value by reducing costs. Not something you often hear. I think for years and years, security leaders, the drive was how do we get more budget? How do we get the people we need? How do we get the stuff we need? All of a sudden we're in a... I don't know if you want to call it a recession at this point, but we're being asked to maybe lay off people, to reduce costs, things like that. So, so where do we start?
First of all, the good news is that overall, surveys that I have read show that people and organizations are willing to spend money on security. So good. Yeah. We're in a good place to be overall. But now we're being asked to be a lot more intentional about where we're spending the money, how we're spending it, and of course, if everyone's budget is slashed, security's budget will probably be cut as well. And so security leaders need to think about how we're spending the money on our own security projects, but we should also look for a way to help the company save money elsewhere. Because yes, as a security leader, I'm thinking about my direct responsibilities to the company, which typically involve managing risk, reducing exposure, taking care of the security responsibilities. But I need to do that while demonstrating value. And that's something that sometimes we don't think about because we're so focused on security. And there are many ways of demonstrating value. You can demonstrate value by saying we've just reduced risk, we've just minimized the impact of an incident, for example, but you can also show value by helping the company save money in many different ways.
Right, so that kind of gets into, and that's always an ongoing conversation about, before we talk about helping the company save money, but the direct savings within security, there's always a question of what metrics do I use? What do I report to the board that's not just, like vulnerability counts or mean time to patch, these kinds of, there's always been a question of whether there's a whole lot of value in those, whether that you can relate them directly to risk or not, right? So that's, is that still a challenge, or are we getting any closer to a consensus on how to demonstrate, how to communicate that value to the business? Can we say we're more efficient now than we were last year? We're using that budget or that money better?
Well, certainly you need to gather metrics that are important, and which metrics you gather are dependent on the maturity level of the organization and what your stakeholders are ready to hear. I think it's hard to talk about metrics in general. That's just such a broad topic.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about demonstrating value through cost savings, then there are several ways in assuring your board or your peers, as a security executive, you got to think about your peers as well, that you're spending the company's money responsibly, and that you have put a lot of thought into where to allocate that limited budget that was assigned to your department. I think one way to do it is in the budgeting process. Usually, you are told vaguely how much money the company is willing to allocate to security. Now, you could also, of course, always say, I need more, and justify that. But let's assume that the company says, look, the economy is tough. We're only going to spend so much. Here is roughly what you need to fit into. Now, you've got some questions to ask yourself. How do I spend that money most wisely? And what I propose is the budgeting exercise that you go through that makes sure that questions every single security expense in a way that I'd love to outline in a moment. But if you tell the story to your board, that this is how I thought about assigning budget to specific projects, and this is why I chose those projects, those expenses, and not others, I think you'll get a lot of credibility, because they will see you as a person who's not just concerned about security, but who also understands the business reality of the organization.
Yeah, business justifications for your spending.
Yeah. And so what that might mean is you're told to spend X in aggregate. Question everything. Start with a clean slate. If you were starting a program from nothing, where would you spend that money? Now, presumably, you will end up with some ways of justifying your existing projects, your existing personnel, the kind of technologies that you want to deploy in the future. But sometimes you might look at an expense item that you currently are carrying and wonder, wait a second, maybe I don't need it at all. Maybe there's a better way for me to spend that money. And so for every expense item that you think you should fund out of that limited budget that you're assigning to it, you should be able to answer to yourself, why am I spending that money? Not just the benefit to security, but the benefit to the company overall.
Yeah.
And I think you should also be able to answer the question, why am I going to spend that money now? Why not a year from now? Like pose the question that way.
Yeah.
This way, you're not just saying, I'm not funding an improvement to my application security program in that particular way. I'm saying I'm not doing it just yet. Or in contrast, if you're saying, this is really important to do now, why now and not later? And then when you're talking to your CFO, your CEO, maybe your board, explain the thought process to them. And I think they'll be reassured that you're making good use of the money they allocated to you.
Yeah. We both worked in product roles, and this makes me think a lot of putting together a roadmap and prioritizing, with limited engineering resources, what features are you going to build? Like, what needs to be there now, and what can we push out to the future? Is it kind of a similar thought process?
Yeah, I think that's one way to think about it. Yeah, I think all of us come into the role of security leadership from different backgrounds.
Yeah.
And build on what you have done before, and use that framework if that works for you. For me, certainly, thinking about managing the security program from the perspective of managing a product, there's always limited resources. That's just the reality of our world, not just at work, but everywhere, I suppose. And so, as security professionals, we're used to saying, you didn't give me enough. Look, we all want more. We always want more. Maybe that's a philosophy in life in general. But it's not useful to just come to the CFO and say, you didn't give me enough money. That is not a useful framing. Instead, you need to frame the conversation by saying, here is what I have decided to fund. Here's how I decided to spend that money within the restraints that you put around me. And here are some of the projects that I decided not to fund.
Yeah.
Because I was limited. And here's the effect on the organization. And now you can have a conversation, and maybe your board, maybe your peers will say, oh, you decided not to fund those projects? We actually think they're important. And now you can decide, should you deprioritize? Or maybe they'll give you more money. Or maybe they'll say, you know what, we gave you too much. Rarely, but maybe.
Yeah, so one of the first things that we tend to do in security with a lot of security products is we have to understand what we have. visibility is a key component, and I think it used to be the top 20 critical controls. I think it's now down to 18, but the first two are still accurate asset inventory and accurate software asset inventory. How can we, so one of the benefits of that visibility, it's a necessity for security to understand what's out there and what risks those assets pose. But also it gives us maybe a unique insight into the organization overall and how these assets are used. So how can we leverage that for cost savings as well?
It's an incredible opportunity to show value to the organization beyond the core mission of a typical security team. Yeah, because what do we want as security professionals? Well, we want good funding, obviously, but more directly, what we want in many ways is a smaller attack surface, right? The fewer devices that are unmanaged, or user accounts that should have been deleted and were not, or SaaS applications that aren't configured the right way, the fewer of these assets are out there, right, the less likely they are to be exploited. So as security professionals, we want to reduce our attack surface.
Right.
It's good for security. We like it when that happens. And it turns out that that's also good for the financial aspect of the organization. And so security professionals who invest into asset management, we know what assets are out there, how they're being used. We know what assets shouldn't be there, what user accounts, SaaS applications, devices are not there. And oftentimes, if you tell the organization from a security perspective, look, this system has been running for 300 days, no one's logged into it, do we really need it? Sometimes the business might say, well, I don't know, what if somebody does need it? Your security concerns, I hear you, but I don't care because I got other concerns related to availability perhaps. But if you approach that conversation by saying, look, here's how much money that system cost us running for 300 days, not being used. And by the way, I found 20 of these. You add up the money and you say, it's good for security, but look, it's not a wise use of the company's resources. And so you can perform your work in asset discovery related to applications that are installed on the system that maybe aren't being used. Bad for security because they're probably not being patched. Bad for licensing costs. You can look at how many users are provisioned into your SaaS application. How many of them are still at the company? How many of them are actually being used? And you can propose to the IT department which user accounts maybe should be deleted. Normally we say for security it's bad, delete them. People don't pay as much attention to security as when you approach them with a financial reason.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the bottom line, and that's, they're more focused on it now, and increasingly more and more SaaS. Everything is billed usually per seat, per month, and you get those savings almost immediately, right?
It's an incredible
within
way
a month
to show value by finding SaaS applications that maybe you don't know you had. There are ways of discovering them. And it's incredibly valuable to also find SaaS applications that are duplicating some other SaaS applications. And allow the company to ask a question like, do we really need 2 diagramming tools?
Right.
Or should we pick just one of them?
Standardize.
Standardize. It's better for security because then there's one area where you can focus your security improvements and oversight efforts. It's probably good for security. And so the reason why this is so exciting is because here's an opportunity for security teams to improve security, but also show value by lowering the organization's costs. And if you partner with IT and other stakeholders, you help them find unnecessary spend. You make them look good because they have cut unnecessary expenses. You probably save them some effort as well in managing applications that don't need to be managed. You improve security. And in many ways, you can also point to those savings and say, hey, maybe some of those savings can come back to security. I helped the company save $100,000. Could we take 20
I
of
would
those?
like 10% of...
10%, yes. I mean, maybe, but it's a good conversation to have because at a broad level, the organization has some money set aside overall to spend on a given year.
Right.
And in many ways, the CFO doesn't really care where the savings will come from.
Right.
They just need to fit into the budget approved by the board. And if you can find the savings elsewhere, you might be able to defend and request to increase the security budget.
So going about that, obviously, first of all, you need to discover those assets, those SaaS applications. You need a method of doing that. But organizationally, who do you need to make friends with? Like, are you going to procurement and saying, hey, can I look through procurement data? Is this more of a thing where, like, something in your SASE tooling, is a mix of all of the above? But I think organizationally, who you're talking to is pretty important too, right? Like, if you want to pitch this as, hey, security can save the organization money, are you going straight to the CFO, or is it the controller, or is it the procurement team? Who are you going to?
Yeah, you really need to make friends with a lot of people. And when I say friends, you don't need to be friends. You got to be colleagues who know each other, respect each other, and recognize that they can help each other. That means becoming familiar with the people who are, in the finance team, the accounting team, the IT team, the engineering team. It really depends on the organization, but you need to understand whom can you help. Like just ask yourself, whom can I help by having visibility into potentially unnecessary resources that put the organization at risk security-wise, but also lead to unnecessary spend. And you can talk to the accounting team and say, hey, let's work together to find out what are people expensing for SaaS applications that maybe have never gone through a formal security review.
Right.
Or you can partner with the IT team and say, hey, let's do a review of our user accounts to see where do they reside and do they still have corresponding accounts in our HRIS system, for example. So the broader your interactions, the more data you will have available to you. It'll help you with your security efforts as you try to minimize your exposure, but also it'll help you find people who can benefit from your effort to improve security, but also find savings.
Love it. Saving the business money. Security saving the business.
That's right.
I never thought I'd hear it. But it totally makes sense. Understanding what's used and what's not used, reduce attack surface, and save the company money. Win, win, win.
We are the heroes of the enterprise.
We are. Very nice. All right. Thank you, Lenny, for joining us today. This is a great conversation. I love positive, hopeful conversations in security. We don't get enough of those. And to find out more about Exonius, please visit securityweekly.com/Exonius RSAC. If you can't stick around for the rest of the live stream, or if you're catching this afterwards, head on over to securityweekly.com/RSAC to find all of the RSA conference coverage by Cyber Risk Alliance. Thank you, Lenny.
Good to be here.